there's been a lot of confusion about the different types of tests. For example, PCR tests, which are very, very high analytical sensitivity, but anyone who's gotten a PCR test out in the sort of regular world outside of the wealthy academic institutions has potentially seen that these tests sometimes take multiple days to return and simply aren't used, they can't be used daily for the most part, nor even 2 or 3 times a week would be a very huge burden to place on PCR testing. So, but when we look at the infection dynamics or the kinetics of the virus within a person, it turns out that the analytical sensitivity of the test, as I mentioned earlier, is not nearly as important as the frequency with which you can test people. And so this is just a diagram. This comes from a paper we published recently in the New England Journal of Medicine, which discusses the frequency issue and frequency versus sensitivity. And so what this is showing is the viral kinetics within an individual. Essentially it shows that if you're testing frequently with a lower analytical sensitivity test, but by the nature of testing frequently, you're more likely, not less, to catch people when they are infectious. And that's because it's all about the frequency. Now, what I'm showing on the y-axis here is the viral load inside of a person after they get infected. Once people become infected, no test will detect them for the first few days during this incubation period when the virus is at very, very low levels. But then PCR will start. If you were able to be testing somebody, every moment of the day, you'd find that PCR will turn positive in a person, and then within about 15 hours, a rapid antigen test, a lower sensitivity test, will also turn positive. And in fact, we just finished a large clinical study that is showing this, and we'll be trying to get that published soon. But essentially, the window between which the high sensitivity and the low sensitivity test is very, very narrow. And so what this is really showing is it's almost never worth reducing frequency in order to gain that improvement in terms of high analytical sensitivity. That's never the appropriate trade-off when you're trying to have a public health test. Its frequency, above all else, will allow you to find somebody when they're infectious. And then the infectious window is only about 5 days. So if you're not giving somebody a result very quickly, then it's not an effective test. If you have to wait 3 days to get your result, then even if you found somebody on day one of their infection, you would be missing almost their whole transmissible window. And so while we continue to make assessments of these different tests based on their analytical sensitivity, what we really should be focusing on is the effectiveness of the test to help abrogate transmission. And when we focus on the effectiveness of the test, then it turns out that low frequency PCR testing or low frequency testing using even a very high sensitivity test is not going to be effective. Because as you see in these two bottom dots here on the high analytical sensitivity metric, if you were just kind of doing this routinely, you would be more likely to totally miss somebody's entire infectious period and then just catch them on their post-infectious period after they've actually been transmitting. So as a public health tool, these very high analytical sensitivity tests, unless they can be done very frequently and with very rapid results, are not going to be as effective as a lower analytical sensitivity, but much more higher sensitivity to catch infectious people when they're infecting type of test. And that's all based on the frequency. And tests like these that I'm holding in my hand here, these are the really inexpensive rapid antigen paper strip tests. They work just like a pregnancy test. You see 2 lines if you're positive and 1 line if you're negative. If these turn positive, it generally means you are infectious. And these tests have also been very, very high specificity, which has been another concern. Out of thousands that we have now used, we still have yet to find 1 false positive. It's been 100% specificity over 5,000. And this actually fits with multiple studies that have happened across the world. So while we continue to evaluate tests based, these antigen tests based against the PCR, based on their analytical sensitivity alone, we really need to take the test program into account in order to best evaluate how appropriate one test is versus another for public health use. Now, this is an example that I like to show. If you have a school-based entrance screening program, for example, and you're trying to keep a school safe, if you open up school and on the first day of school, as an example, you have 5 students who walk into school who are infected or who show up at school on day 1 who are infectious. A PCR test, you could have a 100% sensitive PCR test, but it takes 2 days to return results. If you use that PCR test on day 1, those 5 students will walk around for the next 2 days infectious until they get their PCR results back, and then they'll be pulled out of circulation. So it's 100% sensitive, but you have 10 person days walking around infecting others. So that might lead, for example, to 8 or so additional people infected, and upwards of 20 or 25 people who have to go into 2-week quarantine. On the other hand, if you look on the bottom of this figure, you have a rapid antigen testing program. You have the same 5 kids walk into school, but the test is only, say, 80% sensitive. Now, we know that these tests actually achieve much greater than that when people are infectious, but we'll be conservative. If those 5 students are tested with the antigen test, along with everyone else going into school the first day, the lower sensitivity antigen test will catch 4 of those 5. One of them will slip by because it's 20% of the individuals. So one person will slip by. They will walk around school. Ideally, they are low transmission that first day, which is why they were negative on the rapid test. They weren't quite at the level needed to detect yet. But then maybe the second day, they'll infect 1 or 2 people. But overall, this means that with the 80% rapid antigen test, because you were able to pull those first 4 out on day 1, you had only 2 person days of somebody walking around infectious versus 10. What does this mean? At the end result of this means that despite using a less sensitive test, because it gave fast results and immediately actionable results, you might end up with 1 or 2 individuals infected versus an additional 8. And you might end up with around 5 individuals having to get quarantined versus 20 or 25. So overall, what we see here is that the lower sensitivity test, because it's 2 person days versus 10 person days infectious walking around school, is the better public health test, even if it might not be the better medical diagnostic test for somebody. And so this is just a toy example to demonstrate, and actually we now have real world examples of where this exact scenario has played out.